Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the event-driven programming paradigm within JavaScript. This paradigm simply means that some of our JavaScript code will run in response to events, which are usually user actions. For example, when a user clicks on an element, we might want to write some JavaScript code to respond to that click in some way. So, if we look at this example HTML here, we have a button that says click me, as well as a div with an ID of scrollable. This contains a bunch of paragraphs and some content. And then we have some CSS written as well. This is just for the scrollable container. We give it a height and we set the overflow property to auto. So when the paragraphs are larger than the height, it will need to scroll. And finally, we have an empty JavaScript file. To start looking at event-driven programming, we need to select some DOM elements and what events we want to listen to. First, let's select the button by saying const button is equal to document.querySelector of the button tag. And then to add an event, what we do is we say button, so we take the element we want the event to be on, and we say button.addEventListener. So this is a function that is on the element, and inside of this event listener function, we will pass two primary arguments. First is going to be the event we want to listen to. So for example, the click event, and then we pass a callback function. So when the button is clicked on, I want to call the onClick function, and I will define the onClick function down here. So we can say onClick, and for now, let's simply say console.log you clicked the button. Okay, so we can save this, and if I come over to the browser and I click on this button, you will see we get you clicked the button in the console. I can keep clicking it and we keep getting more logs of you clicked the button. And if we come back over to the code editor, inside of this onClick, we can also add a parameter. So I can say event, and then inside of the body, we could also console.log out this event. So the event is going to be an object that is passed in to every event listener. These can be a little bit different depending on what type of event you are listening to, but they have a few common properties that are pretty useful. So we can also do console.log of event.type, and let's also do console.log of event.target. So I will save all of those, and we can come back to the browser, we can click this button, and you can see we get all of these different logs. So first off, we logged out a pointer event, so this is the type of event that we got from clicking on the button. We logged out click, which was the type, so this is essentially whatever we passed in as the first parameter to add event listener is the type of event that was fired. The event.target is going to be what the event fired on. So in this case, it fired on the button. And then we also have the you clicked the button text as well. Now, similar to event.target, we also can simply log out this. So I can say console.log of this. And this is going to work very similar to event.target, but there is a key difference. So this is going to log out whatever was before add event listener. So in this case, the button. So no matter what, this keyword in onClick is going to be bound to the button. However, event.target is going to be whatever was actually clicked on. And that might sound like it's the same thing, but I will show you an example in a moment where it's not. But for now, let's also remove these other logs so that we can see that both event.target as well as this are going to log out the same thing. So let's save this code, come back over to the browser, I can click on click me, and you'll see we log out the button twice. So once for event.target and once for this. Okay, but let's come back to the code editor, and I want to show an example of where this is actually going to be different. So what we can do is instead of simply saying button.addEventListener, let's also add an event listener to the body. So we can get the body by simply saying document.body, and I want to add an event listener here. So I can say add event listener, and I will add the same event listener. So we will add click, and we will say on click. And then we can add the semicolon here. Now let's save this, come back to the browser, and click on click me. And you can see we logged out the button twice, as well as we logged out the button and the body. So when we clicked on the button add event listener first logged out event.target, which was the button, and it logged out this, which was also the button. But for the click on the body, which is below the button, the event target was still the button. So this is what we actually clicked on. But this ends up clicking on everything below it as well. So this is still going to be whatever is before the add event listener call. So because the event listener was on document.body, this is going to be bound to the body. However, this in the first instance was bound to the button, but both of them have the event target as the button because that is what we actually clicked on. So this is essentially whatever was on top when we clicked on it. Now this process is known as event propagation. So if I come back to the HTML for a moment, we can see what we mean by event propagation. So event propagation happens in 3 phases. First, when an event fires, it starts out at the root, so the root of the DOM, and then it slowly hones in on whatever the target was. So in this case, it would also end up clicking on the body, and then it clicks on the button. So we sort of traverse down the DOM until we get to the actual target. And that brings us to the second phase, which is the target phase. So the first phase is known as the capturing phase, where we move down the DOM, and then the target phase is where we fire the event on the actual element. And then finally, we have the bubbling phase, and bubbling is where we go back up. So we move back to the body, and then back to the root of the file. So we would move back up the DOM in the bubbling phase, and in the capturing phase at the beginning, we move down the DOM. By default, in the capturing phase, no event listeners are actually going to be called. The first event listener will be in the target phase. That is why we logged out the button as the first time. But then in the bubbling phase, when we move back up the DOM, we also call the events on all of the elements we see. So in the case of this JavaScript file, we called the event on document.body during the bubbling phase. So when we moved back up the DOM, we ended up calling the onClick with this bound to the body. Now we can actually change this default behavior. So what I can do is I can say event.stopPropagation. And what stop propagation is going to do is it says stop the propagation process wherever we are. So in this case, the first onClick handler that runs is on the button because it happens in the target phase. And then we call stop propagation. So this says stop going through any more phases. So this means the bubbling phase won't happen, and thus the document body event listener will never fire. So if I save this file and we come back to the browser and we click on click me, you can see all we end up logging out is the button twice. So the event target and this were both the button in the button event listener, but we never call the body event listener because of the fact that we stopped the propagation. However, there is one more argument that we can pass to add event listener. So on the body event listener, I will add this argument that is just true. And what true says is that I want this to be a capturing event. So I want to fire this event listener during the capturing phase instead of the bubbling phase. So now if I save this file and click on click me again, you will see we end up logging out the button as well as the body. And the reason for this is that the body event listener happened first, and we stopped propagation inside of the body event listener, which meant that we never ran the click handler for the button. We could also come over here and comment out the event stop propagation line, run this code again, and you'll see when I click on click me, now we get all of them, but the order has reversed. So we clicked on the body first because this happened during the capturing phase, then we click on the button during the target phase. So the capturing phase is before the target phase. So now the body with the value of true is getting its event listener to fire before the button gets its event listener to fire. Now it is worth noting that not all events propagate, so some events by default do not go through this process at all. For example, if you scroll, it only scrolls on the element that you are scrolling. It isn't going to scroll all of the nested elements. That would be a very confusing user experience. So most of the time you can sort of assume if an event is going to propagate or not. Now coming back to the JavaScript, there is also one other function we can call similar to stop propagation, but instead of stop propagation, what this is going to be is prevent default. And what prevent default does is it stops whatever the default behavior in the browser for that event is. Now most of the time we don't need this, but there are some events in the browser that have some default behavior that you might not want, and if that's the case, you can prevent them using this prevent default function. Okay, so let's remove the call to event.preventDefault. And what I want to show next is that in the event listener, instead of just passing in true or false, we can also pass in an options object as the third parameter. And this object has 4 different values it can take. So first we have capture, and capture is going to work just like that third parameter of a Boolean we had. So if we say true, then the event listener will fire during the capture phase instead of the default bubbling phase. We can also add the value of once, and what this says is that we want the event listener to only fire one time. So after one time, just remove the event. So we can say once is true, and now this event can only happen one time. Next, we can also say passive, and what passive says is if it is true, we are telling the browser that we are not going to call event.preventDefault. The reason this can be useful is it tells the browser ahead of time whether or not it's going to need to run the default behavior, so it can prepare to do that, and it can do it more efficiently. Now, most of the time we don't need to do this, but it can be good for some specific events. Specifically, the touch start and touch move events, which allow you to touch the screen on a mobile phone and sort of scroll that way. Those events, we can cancel that entire behavior. So most of the time when we use these events, we want to say passive is true. This will tell the browser that we aren't going to prevent default and we actually do need to scroll when the user touches the screen. But again, this is just an optimization you can make. It is not going to change any behavior. And then finally, we have signal. So signal is going to point to an abort controller.signal. So we can create this abort controller, and we don't want the entire abort controller class here. We just want an instance. So I can create an abort controller by saying const abort controller and set this equal to a new abort controller. And the idea here is that we can abort an event, which essentially is just going to remove the event listener. So whenever we call abort controller.abort, it is now going to remove this event listener. So for example, if I call this right after adding the event listener, and then we can also remove the call to document body.add event listener. So this is a little bit less confusing. We can save this file, and you can see when I click on click me, nothing is going to happen because of the fact that we called the abort method, which removed the event listener. However, if I comment this out and we save this again, come back and click on click me, you can see we get the button is being logged out as the event target as well as this. However, if I click again, nothing is going to happen. The reason for this is because we have once as true. So because once is true, we can only call the event listener one time and then it gets removed. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this abort as well as these options. We aren't going to be needing these anymore. And one more thing I wanted to show is that we can also manually get rid of an event listener. So we can remove an event listener by saying button.remove event listener. And then what we do is we pass in the same arguments. So I can say click, and then I can say on click. So these are the same arguments as we passed into add event listener. And because I immediately removed the event listener, now when I save this file and we come over to the browser and I click on click me, nothing is going to happen because we immediately removed the event. Now we could remove the event inside of onClick, and this is essentially the same thing as once. So now when I save this, I can click on it once, but after I clicked on it, it removed the event. So now I can no longer click on it anymore. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to come back over to the JavaScript and let's simply discuss a few more common events we have. So instead of click, we could call DBL click. And DBL click is a double click. So this means that you click on the button 2 times. So if I come over here, let's also remove this remove event listener, save this file and click on the button, nothing is going to happen. But if I double click on the button, it fires the event. We also have a few other events we can call here. For example, we can say mouse down, and this is the same as click, but it fires when the mouse is clicked down rather than waiting for the button to be released. And we also have mouse up, which fires when the mouse button is released. So essentially click fires if mouse down and mouse up both happen on the element. Most of the time, these are essentially the same, but they can have slightly different effects, such as if a user clicks outside of the element, then they move their mouse over the element before releasing. That edge case would fire mouse up on the element, but not mouse down or click. Click also usually only looks at the left mouse button, whereas mouse down will allow clicking with the other buttons on the mouse. But anyways, most of the time, we just use click unless there's a specific reason to use one of the other events here. Okay, so let's remove this code, and let's look at some other events. One type of event that can be useful is to listen to keyboard presses. So we can do this on the window. So I'm going to say window.addEventListener, and we're going to add the key down event. So key down is going to listen for when you press a key down. And for now, I will just pass an arrow function. So we can say event, add the arrow function. And what I want to do here is say console.log of event.code. So event.code is going to get the code for whatever key I clicked. So for example, if I save this and we come to the browser and I click the spacebar, you can see it logs out space. And then if I click, say, the J key, it logs out key J. If I click enter, it logs out enter. If I click on tab, it will log out tab, and so on and so forth. Now, similar to key down, we also have key up, which is going to only log when I release the key. There's also a key press event, but this is actually deprecated, so you will want to use key down or key up. Okay, so next what I want to look at is scrolling. So let's remove this code and let's get the scrollable container. So I can say const scrollable, and I will set this equal to document.getElementById, and we will get the scrollable ID. And with scrollable, what I want to do is I want to add an event listener, and we want to listen to the scroll event. And then with the scroll event, I will pass in an arrow function. So we can say event, and we can add an arrow function here. Now what I want to do here is let's console.log, and we can say event.target.scrollTop. And scroll top is probably going to be the most useful property to use with the scroll event. So I will save this file. And now if I come over to the browser and we scroll in the scrollable container, you can see we fire tons of events. So as I scroll, it fires events with the scroll top value. So as a reminder, scroll top is essentially how far down we are scrolled. Now a similar event we have to the scroll event is going to be the mouse enter event. So I will change this to mouse enter. And inside of mouse enter, instead of logging out the scroll top of the target, what I want to do is I want to log out the event.pageX and event.pagey. So I can save this and come back over to the browser. And whenever I put my mouse over this box, so over the scrollable container, you can see it logs out where my mouse was. And if I remove my mouse and put my mouse back over it, it logs out where my mouse was once again. So you can see when I enter at the bottom, we are always getting this Y value of about 145 because that is the page Y value of the bottom of the scrollable container. But if, say, I enter from the top, we will get this value of 45 because the top of the scrollable container is roughly 45 pixels down. And similar to mouse enter, we also have this event mouse move. So if I save this, and now whenever I am over the scrollable container as my mouse moves, we log out a bunch of events. So this event will fire a ton of times, and we are logging out the X and Y coordinates of my mouse when the event fires. Okay, so now what I want to do is let's come back over to the code editor and let's look at drag and drop. So I'm going to get the button back. So we can say document.querySelector of the button, so the button tag. Okay, so now to listen to drag events, what we can say is button.addEventListener. And what I want to do is start with drag start. So drag start is when we start to drag something. So this is useful for drag and drop. When we click on it and start moving the mouse without releasing the click, we call the drag start. And for now, I will add an event that is going to simply console.log out the event. Now, what we also have to do is we have to come back to the HTML. So I will come over here and we have to add to the button a draggable attribute, and we have to set this equal to true. So this isn't a Boolean attribute. We actually need the string of true here. And all this says is that this element can be draggable. Most elements do not default to draggable other than images. So if we want to be able to drag something, we need to set this to true. So I can go ahead and save this. And now you can see if I come back over to the browser and we click on this button, I can actually drag it around. And you can see as I drag it around, we logged out this drag event. Okay, so now let's come back over to the JavaScript, and I will also remove the mouse move event listener because it is clogging up the console with lots of values, and that's a little bit confusing to look at, so we don't need this anymore. Okay, so let's save this. And now what I want to show is how to actually drop the element somewhere. So I want to be able to drop it inside of the scrollable container. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say scrollable.addEventListener, and we're going to listen to the drop event. So for the callback function to the drop event, we will add an arrow function. And inside of this arrow function, what I want to do is I want to say scrollable, and I'm going to prepend the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the button to the scrollable container. And because this is the same element, that is going to remove it from where it was on the DOM before. And next, when we want to be able to drop an element inside of a container, there's one more thing we need to do, and that is we need to go to the scrollable and add an event listener to the drag over event. So this is an event that fires whenever an element is being hovered over the container. And we can add the callback function here as well. And all we need to do here is say event.preventDefault. So the default behavior of drag over is not going to allow us to actually call the drop event. So we need to prevent the default behavior of drag over, and this will allow us to use drop. So now I will save this. We can come back over to the browser. I can take the click me button, drag it, and if it is hovering over the scrollable container, when I let go of it, you can see the click me button is left inside of the scrollable container. It is prepended to the beginning of it because that is what we did in the event listener. Okay, so now what I want to do is let's come back over to the JavaScript. Let's remove this code again. And what I want to look at next is this idea that is known as event delegation. So the concept of event delegation is that sometimes we have some container and we need to run events on the contents of the container, and all of the contents might have the same event listener. And the more event listeners we add to the browser, the slower our page will start to run. Now, most of the time, if we have, say, 10 event listeners, this isn't going to be something we need to worry about. But as our pages and applications scale up, if we have a ton of event listeners, it can actually take a toll on the performance in the browser. So the idea of event delegation is to simply have the event listener be on the parent, and we can utilize propagation to then have the parent call functions based on which child was actually clicked on, so what the target of the event was. So for example, let's take the scrollable container, and I'm going to add an event listener to it, and this is going to be a click event. And inside of this click event, we will add an arrow function as the callback function. And in this callback function, what I want to do is I want to check to see what the target was. So what I will do first here is I will say if the event.target does not equal, so if it's not strictly equal to this. So in the case that we actually clicked on something that was not the container, we clicked on something inside of the container, then this is the case where I want to delegate the event. So in this case, let's just say event.target.textContent. So we are going to change the text content of whichever paragraph we clicked on to say clicked. Okay, so we can add these semicolons here, save this, and you'll see that now when I come over to the browser, if I click on anywhere random inside of the scrollable container, nothing is going to happen. But if I click on one of these paragraphs, say this second one, it is going to change its text to say clicked. I could click on the first one as well. I could scroll down, maybe click on this one. So what it's doing is it is delegating the event. It is checking the event target, and it is running some code based on what the target is, but we only have one event listener, so this can be a little bit more efficient in the browser. Okay, so that's going to be the end of this video on event-driven programming. As you saw, there are tons of events in the browser that we can listen to. We covered most of the more common ones in this video, but do you know that if you're wanting to listen to any other user action, there is probably an event for it. So that will do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.